All right, welcome everyone to the latest Roundtable discussion from the Journal Record. I'm Russell Ray, editor of the Journal Record. Our topic today is loneliness in America. Our discussion today will explore ways business leaders can address worker and family-related loneliness and how these efforts can impact Oklahoma communities. I want to thank our sponsor, Cigna, which has joined the Journal Record for a series of thought leadership roundtables on a range of very important health-related topics. Joining us today for our discussion is Dr. Stuart Lustig. He is a national medical executive for behavioral health with Cigna. Stuart, thanks for joining us today.
Sure, my pleasure. Thank you.
Also joining us today is Dr. Murali Krishna. He is the founder-president of the James L. Hall Jr. Center for Mind, Body, and Spirit, and retired president and chief operating officer of Integris Mental Health. Thanks so much for joining us today. We appreciate it. You bet. Let's start the conversation today by talking about how we define loneliness today as households continue to change. How would you describe a loneliness continuum today?
Yeah, well, I'll start with that. It's really a desire for, loneliness is really a desire for more people in your life, or a different kind of connection with the people who are in your life. So if you feel like you're disconnected in some way, not meaningfully connected from those around you, you feel alone. And sometimes that's situational, to speak to your question about a continuum, and can be short-lived. For example, if you move away from home or move to a part of the world where you don't know anyone, or you recently break up with somebody, those are usually short-term situational factors that cause a feeling of loneliness. But it can also be a more enduring kind of trait for folks who just don't have who they need in their lives on a more ongoing basis.
Dr. Krishna, we were having a great conversation earlier, and I think it's safe to say that most people don't think of loneliness as a public health issue. How would you go about defining loneliness?
It is poorly understood by most of the nation. Most people think of loneliness as some kind of a weakness or a moral failure. Loneliness is a subjective feeling of lack of adequate connections in life. And loneliness in a prolonged way could cause significant problems, physical, emotional, and spiritual, and aging process, and various diseases increase, and our vulnerability to die sooner goes higher. So a number of complications happen because of loneliness. It's a health hazard.
Mm-hmm. A health hazard.
It's a health hazard.
Interesting. You know, loneliness is often thought of as an issue for single people, individuals, or senior citizens. How is the issue impacting other parts of our communities and families? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think certainly people who are single may be at increased risk if they don't have a protective relationship with someone who they are intimate with. But it is not just for, loneliness is not something that just affects single people by any means. One of the most at-risk populations right now is actually young people. And really? We found that out from a survey that we did at Cigna last year, where younger people were the loneliest. And older people were actually the least lonely, which was surprising in some ways, but younger people in particular are lonelier than older people.
I see. Dr. Krishna, would you like to weigh in on that?
That's such a good point. A lot of people don't understand that young, late teenagers, early adulthood is a vulnerable time for loneliness. And then elderly people, of course, most people know about the loneliness, but that happens very late. And that could be also very, damaging.
Is loneliness a greater risk for certain genders, certain races, or income levels, or are the higher risk populations identified through certain social behaviors?
Sure. Well, I can talk about what we found in our study. So we did a study which was a cross-sectional survey of over 20,000 people in the United States, ages 18 and up. And in this survey, which was based online, so there are some biases there potentially, but it was an online survey, what we found, as I mentioned, is first of all, younger people are lonelier, but to your point, really it is a pervasive phenomenon. It really is a public health crisis. Most Americans were lonely, had some degree of loneliness based on the UCLA loneliness survey that we used in the study. And the good news is it's not, to your question, related to race or gender or some of the things that people cannot control. Perhaps it really is more situational factors in one's life. If you think you're getting, if you feel like you're in better health, you're less likely to be lonely. If you feel like you're getting enough sleep and eating right, you're less likely to be lonely. So things that people do have control over, but really, as you said, a very pervasive phenomenon.
Dr. Krishna, what do you think? Is gender, income level, race, is that a factor?
Very pervasive. You know, some studies may show a little bit increase in one gender over the other, but it's not consistent. It's uniform. Mm-hmm. Almost 46% of Americans have loneliness, and that's a staggering figure.
Almost 46% of Americans have loneliness today. Mm-hmm. Now, is that up or down from history?
Significantly up. It has doubled since the 70s and 80s. Much like other things that are happening, we are living in an age of anxiety, mm-hmm. age of addiction, age of obesity, age of preoccupation with the high tech, yeah. And they all have common factors playing a role.
And all those that you just mentioned are drivers behind that increase: obesity, addiction, and other factors as well.
They could be interrelated.
I see. Yeah. I see. Well, we often think about loneliness as a holiday or a seasonal issue, but are there health impacts year-round? And do the holidays exacerbate the issue for some individuals?
Potentially they do. I think the health impacts that we were talking about earlier are pervasive. So we know that cardiovascular health is adversely affected, made worse by loneliness. We know that there is more inflammation in the body. Our immune systems are affected by loneliness as well. And to the point about addiction, when we're lonely, we tend to do riskier things. We take risks. And whether those are choice of sexual partners or using drugs of abuse. So there really are a lot of health effects that are year-long, quite honestly.
I'm probably asking for a very technical answer here, but you mentioned that loneliness can weaken the immune system. How? How does loneliness affect the immune system?
Yeah, so there are a number of chemicals in the body, cytokines, for example, or infection-fighting cells that appear at increased levels in people who are lonely, and that is the tip-off, essentially, that their immune systems are being impacted by people who report that they are lonely.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
The brain goes into a hyper-alert state when one is lonely. So there's more cortisol produced mm-hmm. in the body. There's more inflammation, like Dr. Lustig mentioned. Mm-hmm. And the body's cardiovascular status also is affected. And their genetic makeup also is influenced by loneliness. Higher pro-inflammatory genes are activated. And they also have significantly higher risk of death. If you look at risk of death, premature death, with obesity, it's about 20%. Mm-hmm. With addiction, 30% higher premature death. And with loneliness, people, researchers are finding that's probably 40-45%.
So loneliness is a precursor
yeah.
to obesity, addiction, and other issues, health issues. That
it may play a role in those illnesses, obesity and addiction. Mm-hmm. That it doesn't necessarily, it's not the only factor that contributes to that. There are other factors that play a role in addiction and obesity.
So, Dr. Krishna, do you agree that loneliness is not a seasonal or a holiday issue? It goes much beyond that?
It's pervasive. In holidays there may be exacerbation of loneliness, especially when families get together and when they have disappointments and when they have losses and changes and grief about the people that they love, that they've lost. A lot of and illness, lost illnesses, lost health, but loneliness is pervasive throughout the year in many people.
I see.
The holiday one gets a lot of publicity, rightfully so, but it's more pervasive, more deeper problem than what it is.
We've talked a little bit about the health risks, but let me go ahead and ask, what are some of the more serious health risks around loneliness, especially in potential physical and behavioral health?
Sure. Well, to reiterate, the impact on mortality is significant. The figure that has been widely publicized as being analogous is smoking 15 cigarettes a day is the equivalent impact on your health as being lonely.
Really?
And that's so based on the studies that look at how shortened is your life by smoking 15 cigarettes. So folks who report that they are lonely, it is equivalent to that kind of behavioral impact that affects your cardiovascular system, your lungs, and so forth.
I'm fascinated by that. And again, it's because of the chemical reaction that loneliness creates. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's that, and also the behavioral and emotional impact as well. So to your question, we know that folks who are lonely are more likely to be anxious, they are more likely to be depressed, they are more likely to attempt suicide. So it's a very profound kind of impact that loneliness has. And so, the relationships are complex. It's hard to know, are people depressed and anxious and then they're less likely to seek out other people and then they feel lonely? Or does loneliness lead to these other kinds of things? Or is loneliness moderating a relationship between depression and some other variable? So it's complicated, but they're definitely all in the same pot. They are all associated with each other. So the impact is quite severe.
Yeah. Dr. Krishna?
Individuals that have loneliness also are vulnerable to cognitive decline, especially in elderly people. They see decline of their thinking, their memory, their functional capacity, hastening of their dementia process happens a lot. Their sleep gets disturbed significantly, their metabolism gets disturbed, and in many respects their health goes down.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the influence of social media. We were talking about this earlier. It feels like we're constantly connected. Siri on the iPhone, Alexa talking to us in the living rooms. I've got one of those. The technology to interact is pretty much everywhere. But how is that different than developing cultures of connection in our organizations and families?
Well, I'll start with that. That was one of the things that we looked at in our study, the relationship to social media use. And on the surface, somewhat surprisingly, it appeared that use of social media was not correlated with loneliness. But the truth is a little bit more nuanced than that. What we also found is that people who are worried about the extent of their social media use, people who say, I think I'm using social media too much, was highly correlated with loneliness. So people have some degree of awareness. And I think this probably is generational. As I look out at our studio audience here, the only person I see who is using a cell phone is a person who's recording us, and everyone's over 30. And we've all had the experience of being in a restaurant and looking at a group of young people, and all four of the people at the table are on their phones, and nobody is talking to each other, right? And we don't see that with people of our generation nearly as much. We seem to know how to connect a little bit more. There's a certain wisdom, I think, that comes with age, and that wisdom involves knowing the fundamental importance of human connections. And it's so easy to have that connection sucked out of you by the alluring power of a blue screen in front of you with the very next message on it that's going to give you that dopamine hit in your brain that's addictive. Right?
Very addictive, yeah, especially for people who don't suffer from loneliness. Dr. Krishna, do people suffering from loneliness tend to turn to social media to fill that void?
Quite possibly. It's happening. Frequently, those 4 people at the restaurant will be texting each other, even though they're sitting in front of each other. That's the ironic part about it. We lost track of the value of human connection, like Dr. Lustig mentioned.
We've lost value
of the human connection.
Yeah.
We have decreased value of it. We don't pay as much attention to connecting with each other live as much as we did before, just a generation ago. That's my observation, and research is also
That's a great
showing
observation.
that. And if you look at a human being, if you look at the mind-body-spirit connection, when you look at another human being, when you connect your eyes with the eyes of another human being, something magical happens in your mind, in your brain, in your body, in your spirit. Some of it is quantifiable, actually. And that something magical is fast disappearing from our lives with the advent of technology. Technology is wonderful. It's giving us lots of goodies, lots of advances in life, but also we as human beings have not adapted well enough to utilize technology for our benefit and but not pay a price for using the technology. You know, if you look at the world's evolution, we have mastered the computers, we've mastered the atoms, we've mastered the space to some extent, but we have not mastered our own human mind and our spirit. And most things we talked about today, the loneliness and the addiction and the obesity, the eating issues, and multiple social issues have origins in the mind and the spirit.
You've given me much to talk about with my son, who does have an issue with video games. I'd love to have you talk to him for me.
And they're not necessarily bad, but what is an appropriate usage? What is inappropriate usage? When is it becoming excessive?
Yeah.
And you know, for example, I cut the line for my grandchildren when they're losing human connection excessively, from my observation. When you have guests coming in from the front door and they're not looking at them, they're looking at their computers, there's something wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Their grades are falling down, dropping down, as opposed to being decent grades for which they deserve. Then something going wrong. Their attention and their preoccupation and their spirit is occupied with something that's not vital for their life, for their growth right now. The brain can only grow so much, and there is such a limited time for their personalities to evolve and the brain to grow and the wisdom to evolve, and that time is being lost.
That is good information.
Can we go back to the eye contact topic?
Yeah,
because
sure.
I think that's a really vital point. If we took a piece of paper and drew a circle in it and drew 2 black dots to look like eyes, a newborn whose mother is not present would preferentially look at that circle with the 2 black dots that look like eyes. We are hardwired from birth to look into other people's eyes or look at things that look like eyes. And humans are actually the only mammal, we're the only ones that make eye contact without the purpose of either mating or fighting, which is what all other animals do when they're making eye contact. We have the capacity to look into each other's eyes to create that magic that you're talking about, which is why meaningful face-to-face human contact with people that we care about is really what is curative for loneliness. That is the path to salvation for this loneliness epidemic.
So you said it's hardwired. So when you see someone who struggles to make eye contact, a young person who continually has a problem with making eye contact with people, what does that suggest to you?
Yeah, well, it often comes from a very significant correlate in our study of loneliness, which is social anxiety. The fear of connecting with other people because we are worried they're going to judge us, or they don't value us, or they're not interested. We tell ourselves a series of things that are negative and that scare us away from making contact with people. I think maybe you don't like me or not interested in what I have to say. I'm going to look away and look at my screen instead. So that's the fear of people.
And so that fear emanates from a history or a lack of human connection?
Well, it's always hard to know which comes first, but it could come from something. Some people are more temperamentally anxious, perhaps, or not as secure, and other people are more gregarious. We all know those people, right, who light up the room when they walk in and shake everybody's hand, and they're either faking it till they make it, or they at least really like people, right? And so, and then there are other people who are, generally a bit more. They sort of keep to themselves a little bit.
Yeah.
Social media, the screen, provides an enormous opportunity for people who are shy and anxious to have connections without having to risk that face-to-face contact, which is what is a real connection, what's really a meaningful connection in most cases.
Let's move on. But phrases like work-life balance and family time have become embedded into our workplace culture. How do we create a similar approach on identifying needs around loneliness? Dr. Krishna, you want to take that?
Well, sure. I think the first step towards creating connections is providing venues for people to come together face to face. So this is one of them. For example, we are modeling here in this room, being in the same room together, having a conversation with each other, looking into each other's eyes, right, and making those connections. There are myriad ways, I think, that people could do that, whether it's with their families, with their kids, with their employees, even with acquaintances on the bus. I mean, how often does someone, and this may be cultural depending on what part of the country you're in, but how often do you get to just have a conversation with someone that you don't know, and after that conversation, we feel a little bit uplifted, right? We've had a connection, we've gotten our buzz, and it's not dopamine, right? It's serotonin. We actually have a better sense of well-being as opposed to just quick gratification from the blue screen.
Anything else to add?
Lonely individuals have decreased capacity to empathize or to be able to put themselves in the position of other person. So that leads to a lot of complications. And that may be partly the reason why our nation is so polarized now. Because when you're lonely, when you cannot put yourself in other person's shoes and look at the world through their eyes, then you become polarized. You have all kinds of media sites and other social media that are attracting you to an extreme viewpoints either way. So the other person becomes an unknown enemy, as opposed to somebody that I can empathize, at the same time I don't agree with them. We still can be friends, and we still can be co-workers or neighbors, and still can be a great nation. As opposed to that, you're creating a situation of adversity. And that loneliness leads to a lot of the complications, a lot of the issues with it.
I see. We've talked a little bit already about addiction, and Oklahoma City is certainly a community that has seen the serious impact of the opioids crisis. What connections have been identified between these two behavioral health issues? Any thoughts?
Yeah, as I mentioned, people who are lonely are more likely to turn to drugs of abuse and to get into trouble with those drugs. And that makes a certain amount of sense, because loneliness is a difficult emotion, really, to experience. And so anything that can help take away that pain or mute that pain or blunt it in some way is going to be alluring. So I think that's one obvious connection. We have just shared our loneliness database with researchers at the University of Pittsburgh, who have a database on overdoses over the last 45 years, and we're very interested to see if there's any kind of correlation between reports of loneliness in our data with where the overdoses are. So we'll see. This has just happened. The ink is still drying on the contract, so it'll be probably another year or two before we see what the results are. But we're interested to see, and a little bit nervous about what the result might be too.
Interesting.
We hope it's not too dire yet.
People with addiction feel that they are a square peg in a round hole until they take the drug. Then they feel that they can conquer the world, at least for a brief time, only to find out that's not happening. They become more dysfunctional. Lonely individuals make an attempt to numb their pain, like Dr. Lustig mentioned, not realizing approximately 1 out of 4 of them will have a genetic predisposition for addiction. And so, right there, you have a ready-made hotbed for addiction. 1 out of 4 of them will develop addiction, could develop addiction. The other 3 out of 4 may not develop addiction. So there's a connection there from many angles because they're desperate, they're feeling lonely, they're hurting, and they want to numb their pain.
I see. A major focus in senior health is around keeping seniors independent. So how does preventing loneliness impact those efforts to keep seniors independent?
It's a very interesting question because the independence, I think, refers to a certain degree of functionality, right? We want elderly people, ideally, to be able to cook for themselves, to be able to get around, potentially, to be able to stay in their homes as long as possible. And at the same time, does that lead to isolation, to feelings of being alone and disconnected? And I think the answer, and I'd love to hear your perspective as well, Dr. Krishna, but the answer is I think it depends. It depends on the relationships that people still have, even if they are independent. So if you're able to cook for yourself but have someone over for a meal, for example, that's a good thing. Right? If you are independent because you are able to get out to the park, for example, and go for a short walk to the park and meet a friend there, that's a good thing. If you are simply ostracized from everybody else because you're so independent and disconnected at the same time, not a good thing.
I see. Dr. Krishna?
That's a beautiful point. People that feel connected at a deeper level, they tend to stay healthier and more independent. And people that feel lonely, that do not have that sense of deep connection, they tend to become more ill. In elderly people, strokes are common, and lonely people have higher risk of stroke, up to 32%, one statistic I saw, higher rate of recurring strokes. Similarly, cardiovascular disease, about 28% higher incidence of cardiovascular disease. So all these illnesses, plus increased inflammation, plus impaired sleep mechanism, which in turn decrease the brain's capacity to clean itself, which in turn will affect the cognitive capabilities. So they're all interconnected. Translating to loneliness means less independence, more illness, more earlier death, higher aging process.
So this leads me to ask, what can we do? As business leaders, what are some conversations we can have with our teams on addressing loneliness in our communities and with our employees? What can be done to mitigate this public health issue?
Several things could be done, and I would like Dr. Lustig's opinion, but the most fundamental thing in my opinion is each one of us can take action today to connect with someone that is feeling lonely, to give them some hope, to give them some guidance as to how they could expand their life into more meaningful connections, to encourage them to do some volunteer work, to be more involved in the community, and to do other things that could improve their sense of feeling belonging, a sense of being connected, a sense of being a part of the society. So that's something that we could do, each one of us, in a small way, and that'll make a huge difference. And then whatever roles we play, if we are presidents of a corporation, that we have control over the employees and where they're working and what kind of work they're doing and what kind of environment they have, what kind of hours they have, what kind of activities they have. A lot could be done to foster more connectedness, more interactions, more joyful, meaningful times together. And a lot could be done from that corporation with the society as to how we can stimulate activities and interactions and events that will foster more togetherness, a stronger social fabric in the society. Dr. Lustig.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, I think of the work of Dan Buettner, for example, who talks about blue zones. And blue zones are parts of the world where there is a greater proportion of people who live to be over 100. And how do they do it? Well, there are several things that they do to keep healthy, but the most important thing, I think, is the one you just said, which is there is a real sense of community. People belong, they feel needed, there's a purpose, and there's a group of people who count on seeing them on a regular basis. And so companies can help to create that sense of community as well, right? Whether it's by providing opportunities for volunteerism or civic engagement, whether it's engaging people in meaningful work activities or even leisure activities, the company picnic, for example, or the company event that's after hours or on the weekend or whatever it may be to bring people together.
To follow up on that question, can you give our viewers a couple of ideas that they can take back to their workplaces, their offices, their churches, their dinner tables later today and tonight to help start the loneliness discussion and identify ways to improve our connectivity to each other? Are there ideas that we could?
Number one, most important message I want to convey tonight for your dinner table is that loneliness is a serious health and social hazard in the United States right now. We need to recognize what it is, up to what extent it is devastating our societies, and what kind of problems it's causing, how can we recognize them, and what can we do to help the situation. The second part is an important realization that every human being needs acknowledgement, needs recognition, needs to express their thoughts and their feelings and their hopes and their desires and their frustrations and their dreams. And we as a society need to play a more role in trying to be a good safety net and creating opportunities for people in our religious bodies, spiritual bodies, in our civic organizations, in our schools, in our business community, in the playgrounds and school, and all social areas. We need to promote and stimulate those activities. Those tools.
I think you've described, Dr. Krishna, what it means to be human, essentially, right? And what it means to be human is to connect. And how do we connect? By really listening to each other in ways that I think sometimes we forget how to do. And so the best thing I think parents can do to help their kids stave off loneliness is to talk to them at a time when both of you are available. So it could be the car, it could be dinner, ideally. It does need to be a time when people are not distracted by their cell phones. And that means parents as well as kids, because we're guilty of it too, right? We all walk around with cell phones, and that's how we manage our lives. And sometimes when we listen to other people, it's easy to think that we understand what they're saying before we really do, and we jump to a conclusion because nature abhors a vacuum, and so we try to make sense of what we're hearing. But to really listen to someone means to pause and reflect and say, oh, tell me more. I'm still interested in hearing more. That kind of connection, modeling that and engaging with our loved ones, with our kids, with our spouses, with our good friends, is the way we're going to beat this thing. That's how we're going to reduce loneliness.
Well, Dr. Lustig, Dr. Krishna, I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today. This has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot. I hope you have too. I want to thank our sponsor, Cigna, for making all of this possible, and we'll see you next time.